Howdy folks, my name is Paul Porter. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. I'm a cropping systems agronomist. That's someone who studies how and why farmers do what they do on the landscape. By early May, as we travel west to east across the southern third of Minnesota, from the South Dakota border to the Wisconsin border, we will see farmers have planted most of their corn, and many will be in the process of planting their soybeans. Do you know why farmers plant corn before soybeans in the spring? Corn is originally from Central America and is a more tropical plant than soybeans. Soybeans originally came from Asia. In Minnesota, corn has a longer growing season than soybeans, and corn requires more time to reach physiological maturity. In addition, the growing point of a young corn seedling remains below ground for a longer period of time compared to the growing point of a young soybean seedling. Thus, if a spring freeze comes after the farmer has planted and the young soybean seedling has already emerged from the soil, that corn seedling is less susceptible to death or damage than a young soybean seedling. As you've heard from other speakers in this series, the soils of Minnesota are some of the best in the world for corn and soybean production. Do you know why specifically? Why corn and soybeans? Well, a couple reasons. Minnesota soils are some of the best in the world because of how they were formed many, many years ago, and also because our current climate in the summer is very favorable for corn and soybean production. We get about the right amount of heat in the summer and about the right amount of rainfall for optimum corn and soybean production. It should be known though, and it's hard to see as we cross this landscape, that we actually probably have a little bit too heavy of soils, or a little bit too able to hold water in the soil. So a lot of our farmland is what we call tile drained, and these drainage tiles are put in under the soil. You can't see them except for the surface inlets, and they basically move the excess water off the field in the springtime, primarily when there's excess water, and also late in the fall when there's excess water. Most of the time, those tiles don't contain a lot of water running through them. It's just when there's excess water in the soil profile. So when the farmers first farmed this land, and it hasn't been that long, it's only been the last 100, 150 years at most, that we've really started to farm this land and use it for something other than hunter-gathering. The farmers first had to break up the prairie sod. A lot of southwestern Minnesota was in tall grass prairie. You've heard about that perhaps. And that was a very functioning ecosystem, but it wasn't very productive as far as producing food for human beings. And that's one of the objectives, is to produce food for human beings, fiber to build things with, feed for livestock, and also now more recently fuel. We use a lot of our corn grain for ethanol production. That hasn't been the case. That's just happened in the last 10 years or so. So why corn and soybeans? Well, we've learned how to grow them very efficiently, very, very efficiently in the state of Minnesota. If you look at a map of the United States and look at where corn and soybeans are grown, you see that it is in the west central part of the country that we have the highest production of corn and soybeans. And fully 80% of the U.S. corn and soybean production is located in the upper Midwest. And again, maps will show this. You can look at maps that show the harvested acres by county for all of the different counties. I think in the 12 states in the Midwest, there's over 1,200 counties, and there's data available for how much corn and soybeans are produced by county for any given year. Again, Minnesota has a lot of corn and soybean production in the state. Originally, soybeans weren't grown as much as corn. Corn came in along with wheat when the settlers came and settled the prairies of west central Minnesota, southwest Minnesota. One of the first crops they grew was wheat and corn, and it wasn't until much later, the 30s, the 40s, and the 1950s, that soybeans came on board. And one of the big factors was the ease of harvesting corn. You could harvest the ear and save and store the ear of corn, but it was pretty hard back in the days before we had combines to actually harvest soybean grain. But with the advent of combines, we are now able to harvest the corn and the soybeans in a very efficient manner. So if we do look at the production of corn and soybeans over the last 40 or 50 years, we see that the percent land in corn and soybeans in the upper Midwest has increased dramatically since the 1970s. And there's charts available comparing 1972 with 1998. And back in 1972, very few counties had more than 75% of the total land area in either corn or soybeans, planted to either corn or soybeans. 75% of the total land area just in those two crops. By around the turn of the century, by 1998, there were over 125 counties in the upper Midwest that had over 75% of their total land area planted to corn or soybeans. It's very economical. Farmers realize that, and they've adopted the practice on a large scale across southern Minnesota. If we look specifically at Minnesota, we see that there are a number of counties that actually have more than 85% of their total land area planted to corn or soybeans. That means there's only less than 15% of the land area devoted to any lakes or rivers or roads or towns. So quite an intense production of corn and soybeans in southwestern Minnesota. Why southwestern Minnesota? Why not further north? And again, it's a couple of reasons, both back to soils. The soils were formed under prairies in southwestern Minnesota. That's a little bit better agricultural land than if those soils had been formed under forested conditions. Another factor that we'll run into, and farmers run into it, is rainfall. There's more rainfall as you go further east, and that's a factor, but it's mainly because of the prairie soils being more productive, a little bit flatter land in the southwestern part of the state, better temperatures than if you go further north. So our farmers plant corn and soybeans. Usually they use the same equipment, and they plant on row width of about 30 inches. Depending on the equipment they have and what other plants they grow, often they'll use the same planter to plant corn and soybeans, plant on rows that are 30 inches apart. Some will plant on 15-inch rows, and some will drill their soybeans. If a farmer's planting corn, the optimum seed density of corn, number of seeds per acre, is around 30 to 35,000 seeds or plants per acre for corn. It's 3 times that, roughly, for soybeans. So a lot more soybeans per acre planted than corn. And again, this is related to the production, the productivity of these two different crops. Corn, of course, is a grass. It needs nitrogen fertilizer. Soybeans are legumes, and a legume is a crop that has an association with some bacteria in the soil. With that association, they can get all the nitrogen they need from that symbiotic relationship. So our farmers in Minnesota will tend to put nitrogen fertilizer on our corn crop, but not fertilize with nitrogen the soybean crops. The other major crop inputs include uh, phosphorus and potassium. Both corn and soybeans use a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, so they're going to need adequate amounts of those three macronutrients in order to have maximum production. Um, and it's important that because we're taking these elements off the soil when we harvest the crop and remove the grain from the landscape, we need to replenish the land with those nutrients. And again, those are the macronutrients, the most important nutrients: corn, phosphorus, potassium. So our farmers over the years have really increased their ability to produce corn and soybeans. If we looked at a chart and saw corn yields, which is a measure of productivity in terms often related in terms of a bushel per acre. And you have to learn something about a bushel. A bushel is a certain volume. Had to do with the pioneers and being able to carry a certain amount of grain, and that bushel basket was that kind of standard amount. We still use that standard today in defining yields. And oftentimes we talk about corn yields and soybean yields in terms of bushels per acre. If we look specifically at corn yields, our corn yields were under 50 bushels an acre back at the turn of the last century up till almost the 1950s or so. With the advent of better agronomics, better genetics, our farmers have increased their yields roughly threefold. And today, in the last 5 years, yields below 160 bushels per acre would be not considered good. Some farmers will be well above 200 bushels per acre, but across the state, average yields, when we get adequate rainfall and not too much rainfall, will now today be in that 160 to 180 bushels statewide. With respect to soybean yields, we don't get nearly that much yield. A good yield today, 40 to 60 bushels. The statewide average in the last couple of years has been up over 45 bushels per acre. Again, if it's too dry or too wet, crops won't yield so well. Most of our fields out as we're running across southern Minnesota or biking across southern Minnesota, we won't see irrigation systems. Most of our corn and soybeans are considered dryland agriculture. There's no irrigation associated with their production. And I should mention something about the production levels. We'll have close to 9 million acres of corn planted in Minnesota this year, 7 million acres of soybeans planted. Key points to keep in mind: the trend is upward. We're producing more corn than we've ever produced. We're producing more soybeans than we've ever produced on a per acre basis and on a total statewide production basis. Our farmers are good. They're very efficient, very productive. Thanks. Edit the hell out of this, Brian.